Pius is continuing to, look at the past several years leading up to this encyclical, and he says, "It is a certainty which can be readily be verified that the more marvelous the progress of the motion picture art and industry, the more pernicious and deadly has it shown itself to morality and to religion, and even to the very decencies of human society." Very strong blanket statement. Interesting, that later we see John Paul II in his speech for the 100th anniversary of cinema in 1995 saying, the church's judgment of this art form is on the whole positive. But of course, by that time, I don't think you can say that the moral situation is any better, probably much worse than the one that, Pius the 11th was decrying then. So I think that's simply, Matt, like a shift in like the way that the church attempts to like work with the world and encourage it. Anyway, I think it's just like a shift in emphasis and sort of pastoral tact there.
It's that, and it's also the evidence of, like, again, we'll get into this with the Pius XII stuff, but there, the late 1940s, 50s, were this merging of like Catholic principles with the form of film. Like that's how neorealism is a strong argument to be made, that neorealism is a fundamentally Catholic kind of style.
Okay.
And so I think there was a lot of things changed between 1936 and the end of World War II, to really bring cinema formally within kind of like a Catholic ethos.
So Pope Pius mentions the motion picture production code in coming into play in 1930, but he says that promise of self-censorship was not carried out, and therefore the Legion of Decency was born. For those who don't know about the Legion of Decency, I'll read his description, which is a good summary of the kind of things that they were doing. Quote, "Your leadership," meaning the bishops, "called forth the prompt and devoted loyalty of your faithful people, and millions of American Catholics signed the pledge of the Legion of Decency, binding themselves not to attend any motion picture which was offensive to Catholic moral principles or proper standards of living. We are thus able to proclaim joyfully that few problems of these latter times have so closely united bishops and people as the one resolved by cooperation in this holy crusade. Not only Catholics, but also high-minded Protestants, Jews, and many others accepted your lead and joined their efforts with yours in restoring wise standards, both artistic and moral, to the cinema." So the Legion of Decency was rating films, as many people know, but they also would have people in parishes take this pledge, which I think was voluntary, but maybe there was also some kind of like obligation of obedience to your bishop anyway, even if you didn't take the pledge, depending on what the bishop wanted to do. Not to watch films that had been condemned, or, not to allow your children to see, films that had been deemed appropriate only for adults, etc. So Pius is very happy with the success of this crusade. This word that he keeps using, again, goes to show just like the vast difference between, the culture of the church then and now. So he says that because of your vigilance and because of the pressure which has been brought to bear by public opinion, the motion picture has shown an improvement from the moral standpoint. Crime and vice are portrayed less frequently. Sin is no longer so openly approved and acclaimed. False ideals of life are no longer presented in so flagrant a manner to the impressionable minds of youth. And without getting into, the details of pre-code films or, films under the early code, basically, from what I understand, a big part of the issue is, they were just throwing sex into films a lot to sell, and B, they were the subject of matter of films was just increasingly tawdry. Like it was either like sexual, or they were all like gangster films, a lot of revenge films, and just a lot of like morally problematic stuff. But the argument made by Catholic opponents of these kinds of films and proponents of the code and the Legion was basically that the film industry had gotten really lazy, that there was like this crisis in creativity in the film industry where they were basically just trying to draw people in with this lowest common denominator material, and there was less and less variety in the plots, less and less stuff that sort of the whole family could see, as people complain about now, and that there was just kind of less artistic excellence, and that people were actually losing interest in going to the movies, because of that, because they were sort of getting sick of the same stuff and just sort of having such negative insinuations being made about society and all the films that they were watching. But that's something to go into more detail about in a separate discussion.
I think this is worth mentioning. The pre-code era, is 1930 to 1934, and so it's coming on the heels of the stock market crash.
Well, the code was 1930.
The movie business. Yeah, the code was written and introduced in 1930, but it wasn't enforced until 1934. So what we think of as the pre-code era refers specifically to these 4 years where Hollywood said, we're going to...
I thought it was all the pre-code
No,
years.
it's only 1930 to 34. So because it basically is the period where Hollywood said, okay, we're going to police ourselves, and then they don't.
Oh.
And instead of not only did they not police themselves, but they doubled down on salacious subjects and material, and in some cases nudity, violence. This is the era of Little Caesar and Scarface, for those who know those films, which nowadays don't seem, in terms of violence, maybe don't seem as violent to us today. But if you actually try to watch a movie like Scarface, try to put yourself in that position and just take it for what it is. It's an incredibly violent film. Doesn't have to be graphically violent in terms of blood everywhere or whatever, but it's a very intense experience. But
interesting.
Anyway, so the pre-codes were they're partly a bid to excite the audience, excite the lower passions, but they're also dealing with the stock market, the loss of business, stock market crash. And then also the other thing is that you mentioned the artistic qualities kind of dropping. I think that's also partly tied to the talking film is introduced. And so because recording sound was so cumbersome, the fluid way of making films, the moving camera, very kind of fluid sense of the visual style, that really, once microphones were introduced, that really kind of stopped and it slowed down until technicians could figure out how to actually move the camera and move mics at the same time. And, by the mid 1930s, that starts to get more sophisticated again. But there was this period where everything became like a filmed play almost. And so there's an argument to be made that maybe audiences were getting kind of tired of formally seeing the same kind of stuff over and over. So how do you compensate? Well, let's put more, obscene kind of content, or salacious, or just excitable. It's very comparable. He used the term marvelous, in the document, the more marvelous, here we hear the same, we could say in the same way, spectacle, there's like a very strong sense of the sort of the traditional Christian condemnation of spectacle that we see in the early church fathers, of like the Roman, circuses and the plays and the, just like the sordid displays that the early Christians were, supposed to stay away from. We see a very similar kind of like tone here. And like this idea that these are marvels in the sense of trying to excite the base passions. They're not, spectacles in the more generous reading of, hey, we love Tolkien, we love Return of the King, that's a beautiful spectacle. It's like, he's not talking about that. We're not talking about spectacle purely like as a beautiful thing. It's like, marvels that are meant to incite the passions.
Right.
So I think it's important to kind of clarify that, because again, we could look back and go, hey, what does that really mean?